Hi, I'm Dudley Evenson.
And I'm Dean Evenson.
And we are welcoming you to our gardens, but we want to share with you some fun stories about our recent journey to Monets Gardens. We just released our album, Monets Garden. It was based on our journey to France a couple of years ago. We were very fortunate to get there before everything closed down, and we had literally the trip of a lifetime. In fact, we started out in Paris, where we went to all of the museums where Monet's paintings were hanging.
Yeah, it was really wonderful to be around such beautiful artwork.
So really the source of impressionist painting, and just to be able to see them hanging in the L'Orangerie, a little bit in the Louvre, but the Musée d'Orsay, and then we also went to the Musée Monet, which is has a lot of the later Monet paintings. We really enjoyed being in L'Orangerie. Do you remember that one with the big paintings?
Yeah, the decorations, as they were originally called. Monet did these huge paintings, 8 by 20 feet. It's huge. And he created them to create an environment where you walk into a room with all his paintings surrounding you, and you get a real feeling for what his interpretation was, what was happening in his garden.
I appreciate those paintings in particular because they were done around the time of World War I, and I believe some of his children were actually involved in the war, and it was really encroaching upon Giverny, where he lived with his family, or his family had probably grown up by then, but it was an important, almost like a art therapy for him, would you say?
Well, he didn't stop painting. He dedicated himself to continuing on, no matter whether the war was happening or not. He disliked the war and wasn't going to allow the war to stop his work. And he painted all the way through the whole war and created some of his masterpieces in the process. So he worked out his own methods and own lifestyle by going and painting and painting and painting. His style of painting, he did the big, huge paintings in his studio, but he also would go out into nature a lot and do paintings based on the different times of the day, which had different kinds of light. There's a special atmosphere where he had his studio, and as the day goes on, the moisture content in the atmosphere changes, and so the quality of the image changes. And he worked it. He would have 6, 8 paintings up, and he would go from one to the other as the day went on, and created this beautiful collection of the same objects, the same nature, but the different times of the day.
Well, the Impressionist painters were the first ones who really painted en plein air, as they say, outdoors. Before that, painters would probably do sketches, and they would then come back in and paint them in the studios. But these painters really loved nature, and they made a special point to be outside as much as possible painting.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I appreciate about your work, Dean, because with your video work, that you just love to be out there different times of the day and videoing.
Yeah, getting that image that really makes you feel like you're there and feel alive.
I think you're in an immersive environment. And when I watch your videos, the same. as when we look at Monet's paintings. It's very immersive. You feel there's also a sense of intimacy. I think that's important. It's not like just these big, vast landscapes, which have their place, but he really goes into detail, as you do when you're looking at the river or the mountains or the streams or the garden, particularly the gardens.
Yeah.
I really get a feeling. So after we were in Paris, we went down to Giverny, or actually up to Giverny, took the train a couple of hours, and stayed in a beautiful old renovated inn that was literally 1 block from Monet's gardens, where his home had been. And what we learned, tell them about the cider mill, how they first bought this old cider mill.
Yeah, Monet was looking for a place to set up a studio, and they came across this old cider mill, and it had been used as a cider mill, and it wasn't functioning that way anymore. But he purchased it and reconglobulated the whole place and just put flowers everywhere and plants everywhere and created more of a pond. It was right next to a river, so he made an arrangement with the local government that he could tap the river.
Divert the river into the pond, yeah.
And
or some of the river, I guess, not the whole river.
No,
right?
just parts. The wet part.
The wet part. Well, I just love the idea of them coming and buying this old, almost abandoned cider mill, and there was a barn next to it, and it was, and then he made his studio in the barn initially, and then later they made that particular section of the building became his salon, where he would sit and enjoy the evening with his family. And then they eventually built another. I think he had a couple of studios, and eventually built a much bigger studio, which now houses the gift store at in Giverny at Fondation Claude Monet, which is the nonprofit that is managing the gardens now. I learned something interesting that after Monet died, his daughter-in-law, who was also his stepdaughter, she had married. This is the daughter of his second wife. She had married his son, and so part of the household. And then eventually that son died. I can't remember why, but anyway, she ended up being one of the kids who stayed with him to the end, even after his wife Alice died. And her name was Blanche, and she stayed with him as a loyal, helpful friend and hostess for all the many guests that he had. But then when she died, I think, and then the building went to his other son, and then eventually he died. And so there was at least about a 40-year period where the gardens just went into complete disarray and nobody was tending them. And that is one thing that we have learned about gardens, is that when you don't take care of them, those buttercups and extra things all start growing up around them. And pretty soon you lose those beautiful flowers that were planted so carefully. So toward, I believe it was the late 40s, and this was another interesting thing, because after Monet died, his paintings were in the Musée de Lingerie, which is that beautiful oval-shaped building that has, or oval-shaped rooms that has these big paintings. There wasn't that much interest. Abstract expressionism and all sorts of modern art was coming in, so it's almost as if Monet was at the beginning and lasted through the entire popularity of Impressionism, because when he died, people just weren't all that interested until after World War II. We heard that a lot of the American GIs who had been in France during the war were on some kind of, going to college or whatever, and they all wanted to go back to France, and they wanted to see the Monet paintings, and they wanted to see Monet's gardens, but of course they were in absolute disrepair. So I believe it's the Academy of Beaux-Arts, they ended up owning it and managing it, and eventually put the gardens back together. So it was only in the 70s when those gardens finally became similar to what Monet had created.
Right. But they're beautiful. They've spent a lot of time bringing it up to a level that reflects what it was when Monet was living there.
Well, he had gardeners, but he also was very engaged.
Yeah, he did gardening himself.
And he planned. He planned the flowers. He wanted big swaths of color, so you don't see things as mixed up as much as big swaths of violet irises or crimson poppies and
Yes, those violent artists.
Oh, violent. Violet.
He basically planted his garden, planted his flowers, so that they would have color happening in the garden at all times. And so different times of the year, different flowers would go off. And he got the right flowers to go and to off at the right time by planting the right ones at the right time, naturally enough.
Well, you recently decided to plant your own version of that.
I got inspired to, after seeing his garden, to do some planting here, some increase the amount of color that we have and variety of color that we have in our garden. And we planted gladiolas, and they're spectacular.
Blooming right now.
Yeah.
Amazing. So I imagine you'll be videoing them
Yes, that will happen.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
He just brought gardening to a new level and painting along with it. And we really were so privileged to spend those 5 days in Giverny in the actual gardens themselves.
Yeah.
It was pretty special. We were also pleased to realize when we came back to our own home that we are surrounded by many of the same gardens and types of flowers that Monet has.
Yeah, it's quite amazing to walk through our gardens too. They're not as extensive as Monet's, but they have a lot of variety and a lot of depth in what is going on in our garden. So we're doubly interested in what's happening. And I'm also doing a lot of these studies of the flowers in our garden. And the more I spend time with flowers, the more I enjoy it, because they're so beautiful.
We were very fortunate to be able to purchase this property over 20 years ago, and the woman who lived here before us for years had done nothing but plant flowering bushes and perennials, and we're surrounded by I must have 15 different types of rhododendrons that bloom in the spring, particularly in May. Azaleas, fragrant azaleas. We have irises and lilies and all sorts of things. And then, and we have the willows. It just seems like everywhere we turn is something similar to what Monet had. And then at our studio in town, right next door to the studio, is a beautiful pond that is actually owned by the city now, and it's partially owned by the city because of work we did for many years to preserve an urban forest, and in that process a number of greenways levies got voted on, and so this pond was purchased, and there's actually a path around the pond, and there's lilies, and it's just so similar. That's very similar. And I just want to say too, for me, having lived in Japan, it was exciting to see the Japanese influences, because that's what those water gardens are all about, and the little the wisteria growing around the Japanese footbridge, and just how he was so influenced during the time. And think about the late 1800s. The world was actually getting smaller. People were traveling and learning about art and culture from different places, and Japanese art became very popular, and I think was a big influence on Monet. So Dean, as long as I've known you, you've been a fan of Monet, and then only recently we've just been talking about how that came to be. What was it about Monet that inspired you so much?
It sparked my interest, so to speak. Well, I grew up in a conservative religious environment, and my parents were very involved with the church. And they didn't get into the art world that much. My father was into music, but not into art. And so I started exploring things as I got into my later years of high school and looked and found there was a group of artists, Monet being one of them, that challenged the classical art world on what was good art. And the establishment wouldn't take on representing the more modern impressionist artists until they finally reneged and did let those artists exhibit.
So he really broke barriers. He broke cultural and artistic
Yes,
traditional
he
standards.
definitely pushed the river, so
Pushed
to
the
speak.
envelope. Well, it started a whole new genre.
And that inspired me. It gave me a perspective that I could explore new areas of thinking and new ways of thinking. And I could study art differently. I can study music differently. And so I did. I enveloped myself in the modern approach. And that's how our music evolves.
Well, I think there's so many parallels between you and Monet as far as breaking boundaries and coming up with new forms of art and expression and music. Because when we started our peaceful relaxation music in 1979, there was nothing like it, at least that we were aware of. There were a few musicians around the country who had kind of also exploring this kind of music. We had heard Paul Horan play flute in the Taj Mahal. We loved that, and that inspired us a lot. So you did already have that kind of energy going. But when had been doing video through the 70s, and then by 79 we had all these videos with no place to play them because the technology hadn't caught up with the distribution. And so when you went out in the desert and...
Yeah. We also were concerned about the environment and what decisions were being made by the moneyed people. And we wanted to help the population, the human race, to get a handle on what it was to live here. It wasn't just gobble up the whole earth and spit it out. There was an earth here that was beautiful and wonderful and available.
No, it's the source of our physical livelihood and of so much of our spiritual livelihood, too. And I think, when we started our kind of peaceful music, Dean had recorded the birds at dawn in the desert, and then we added our flute and harp, and our friend Jonathan Kramer played cello, and people said, we don't know where to put this. They never heard anything like it. It helped them relax. It helped them be peaceful and deal with chronic pain, all sorts of things.
Yeah. It went way beyond what we thought we were doing.
Yeah, we were making we were making peaceful music, and we had been influenced by the protests of the 60s and realizing that we knew what we were against, but we didn't quite know what we were for. And that's what our decade of living in the school bus and doing our videos was about in the 70s. But when late 70s came along, we wanted to learn. We weren't just doing things for ourselves. We wanted to share it, and we wanted to learn about distribution. So that's how we ended up starting our record label, Soundings of the Planet. And we just kept going, and it was just like you had to take one step at a time and keep trying to...
Yep, there's the next step. Take it.
So anyway, we just wanted to share a little bit with you about our connection with Monet, with Claude Monet and Impressionist art, and how important it was to us. We also visited Étretat, which is up north a little bit on in the Normandy coast, and that's where he painted those cliffs. We stayed in Honfleur, which is this beautiful 1,000-year-old village. Fishing village, and that was just amazing, very artistic. And Monet had spent a lot of time there. He was actually from the Havre, which is the big port, which is across the river. This was right at the mouth of the Seine. And then about north of that a bit was the Etretat cliffs. And so we were just thrilled to be really immersing ourselves in the art and culture of Monet's Impressionist France, and just how it ties in with a lot of what we're doing today.
Yeah, we have been honored to spend time thinking in the way that Monet did, and learning what he was bringing through in his life for others to share. We learned a lot about him, and of course we learned a lot about ourselves. And the going to the garden itself was a meditation process. It freed us up to just become neutral and listen to the music of the universe that was coming through the wonderful garden that Monet created.